Okay, here we are.
Okay, thank you. So this project is about political vocabularies, but I also have a question, which is, what do we mean when we say that a vocabulary is political? And can we tell when a vocabulary becomes political? And looking beyond bare vocabulary, how do linguistic genres and registers change too? So I'm going to explore these questions by following the tribal Sora of Odisha through their parallel transition from shamanism to Christianity, and from parasitic feudalism, as I call it, to party politics and electoral democracy. Is my screen not visible?
This is Frank speaking. I cannot see anything. I'm sorry to say. I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Shall I just continue anyway?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Lisa, can you please check?
You can go to the settings. This is the upper icon, and click there to refresh a video.
So settings, and then there's a panel that opens up and a little round arrow, refresh video. It should work then. Both for Vibha Joshi and he wasn't able to see. Okay, Piers, carry on.
Right. Since I first started speaking Sora in 1975, I've witnessed the adaptation of meanings and to express changed values and structures, and also the creation of new words. Now, Sora is a language of the South Munda branch of the Austroasiatic family, and they are surrounded by Indo-Aryan Odia and Kond and Telugu speaking Dravidian on the other side. Now, in the 1970s, most Sora were monolingual. I'm now getting an echo. Most Sora were monolingual, and the oppressive system, which I call feudal, was closely linked to their ignorance of the dominant state language, Odia, which is now well known by younger generations through processes I shall describe. The answers to my opening questions, sorry, I have to turn that off. The answers to my opening questions look very different if we consider two different senses of politics. And I take these from a discussion by Anastasia of two strands in the thoughts of Machiavelli. One is about politics as directive action, and for this I can find few, if any, traces of an indigenous Sora vocabulary of leadership and command. The statist political lexicon which pervades Sora life has all been borrowed from outsider languages in colonial and now post-colonial times. However, if we consider another sense, that of living together well, there is a highly elaborated indigenous vocabulary articulated through words surrounding kinship and spirits. And in fact, in the 1970s, kinship and the spirit realm were still indistinguishable. Sora society functioned largely through dialogues between the living and their dead ancestors. These dialogues cover both emotional attachment and issues of inheritance, so that shamans, or the spirits who speak through them, are both psychotherapists and probate lawyers. There is no higher level of arbitration, and the frequent instances of resorting to sorcery or police are seen as failures to negotiate. Now, this vocabulary is set within speech genres of coercion, persuasion, obligation, inclusion, exclusion, and predation. And we'll look at some of those words in a moment. I shall analyze these in terms of two dichotomies. The first is insider-outsider, and the second is horizontal-vertical. And these largely overlap. In this very introverted cultural world that I first knew in the 70s, these dialogues were a genre of intimate negotiation among beings who are fundamentally equals, despite differences of being alive or dead, having or not having a body. Now, against outsiders, on the other hand, one behaved with speech genres of defense, evasion, or irony. So while the vocabulary of leadership and command is almost entirely in outsider languages, the vocabulary of internal relations, of living together well, is almost entirely of indigenous Sora etymology. I'll show you some of this first, so that you can see also how different it is from the Aryan or Dravidian languages that you know. And you'll also see how the domain of relationships shades from kinship into existential life forces. Could we have the first slide, please? Lisa? Thank you. Can you see that first slide? Enough to read it? Yeah, is it visible? Okay, you're not going to study it in depth, of course. It's just to give a sort of example.
Yes, Lisa, how do we make it full screen so we can read it?
Just click twice on it.
Double click on it and then you'll see the slide properly. Okay, Piers, we can all see it.
Okay, fine. So the way it works is that dead people feel hungry and they miss the living. And through this longing, they cause the living to experience the same symptoms from which they themselves died. Every time you fall ill, this is a reminder of your attachment to a dead person. And this person has started to eat your soul. And the cure consists of offering the soul of a sacrificial animal as a substitute and negotiating verbally as the dead person speaks through the mouth of a shaman in trance. If the dead person accepts this substitute, you recover. If not, you die from a repetition of their illness. So each dead person starts out in this harmful form and is gradually persuaded through these dialogues to become a proper protective ancestor. Can we have the first video, please? What you'll see here is shamans in trance embracing mourners and dead people speaking through the shamans.
So everyone double click on it to see it.
And the sound seems to be missing.
Yes. Lisa, we need the sound, please. Can you start at the beginning?
Okay, thank you. So in terms of genre, you notice, of course, that is a very intense hubbub of mutual relationships. And we'll see a very striking contrast with behavior in church in a moment. So the relationship between ancestors and descendants is a cyclical one of mutual hunger and feeding. At the price of causing the pain of illness and death, the dead also infuse their soul force into the crops which their descendants eat on land which they have inherited. And a spirit attack, when a dead person is still in this aggressive, dangerous mode, is represented by a vocabulary of devouring violence. So which spirit is eating me is the usual way of saying, how did I fall ill? And protective counter moves by shamans fends this off with a vocabulary of protection, which has an entirely Sora etymology. Could we have slide number 2? So again, without studying it in detail, you can get the tone, I think, of aggression and defense. Now, dialogues between living and dead take place in the everyday language of family banter and arguments. And Sora social relations are strikingly egalitarian, especially for India. And outside the language of kinship, the patrilineages, I can't compile a list of indigenous Sora words for any offices or positions of status. So in external relations, this internal horizontality is pitched against a feudal principle of domination. And this was vertical, but I'll later argue that it was not hierarchical in a true sense. Why not? because it was a structure of one-way extortion, exploitation, and inequality. In colonial times, this remote tribal frontier was designated an agency area in which local tribes lived under little Hindu kingdoms. And in Soraland, the British established a police station and weekly markets in 1866 and also executed resistance leaders. The Sora were kept away from any direct communication with the outside world by police informers called Barik, from an Odia low caste called Pano or Dom. And these held a monopoly on interpreting between the two languages. Sources reveal a relentless striving to squeeze revenue out of an underdeveloped area. Competition between local Rajas, their Zamindar sidekicks, and the more distant British administration to carve up between them what little revenue there was. Chronic indebtedness at all levels. Feudal henchmen with grandiose titles, in effect licensed bandits, who extracted unlimited free goods and labor from the tribals. Freelance traders and moneylenders who exploited the tribals even without these titles. And a resigned recognition in government reports that administration of any sort was possible only by relying on these go-betweens. Now, these structures spilled over from the colonial times into the independence period and well into my first fieldwork in the 1970s. I call them feudal, though from my Sora-centric perspective, I don't see much of the integrative panoptic vision that is conveyed so well by specialized historians of the little kingdoms of South Odisha, people like Berkema and Schnepel. The Raja's agents seize and eat the Sora, just like the greedy, violent spirits in this vocabulary list here. But without those ancestral spirits' reciprocity, they can't be converted later into proper ancestors to feed and redeem the dead. So that's why I call this predatory kind of feudalism parasitic. So all of these are in Odia, bits of Sanskrit, bits of Hindustani, but not Sora. Can we have slide number 3, please? In that, you'll see some words you'll recognize from other languages, probably. This vocabulary corresponds to a strong insider-outside boundary that divided the old Sora world from their neighbors. You notice every single word there is a noun, but each one denotes not a concept, but a position. All these positions are defined in relation to kingly or state power, and this power has a distinctive political property. You can't participate in it as a subject or agent, but only as its object or victim. All you can do is endure it or outwit it or evade it. There's no procedure of dialogue or negotiation except perhaps for humble petitions, and its legitimacy, or at least its sullen acceptance, rests on the threat of violence without redress. So these are the structural elements of a world of extortion without responsibility. And this is very much what I was still seeing in the 1970s. This lack of agency was symbolically mediated through two ambiguous intermediary roles: the Sora headman, village headmen, who were always male, and the Sora shamans, who were usually female. And each of these had their own relationship to outsider authority. So to look at the shamans for a moment, even while operating their tribal cosmology, supposedly non-Hindu, Sora shamans gained their ability to trance by marrying spirits in the underworld, which were high caste Hindu Rajas, policemen and clerks, that is, Kshatriyas. They rode horses and elephants. They were attended by rows of armed guards, as depicted in shamans' wall paintings. And though these spirits spoke to the Sora in Sora, they were actually Odia spirits, and they spoke and wrote Odia, which was unknown to the Sora back then. It was they who compelled the Sora dead to negotiate with the living by arresting them and entering their names into logbooks of underworld police stations. So you can see that the Sora shamans and that whole society fetishized literacy, while their shamans married a fantasy projection of the state. The headman had a more obviously political role, but this placed him in a compromised position so that he was often resented by the villagers, whom he partly protected and partly exploited by playing a double game. He enjoyed a pale reflection of the kingly imagery of the Raja, from whom his authority was ultimately derived, though this was cramped and manipulated by the low-caste Odia police informers called Barik. when I arrived in the 1970s, the Rajas and their henchmen were still present in the conservative imagery of shamanic ritual, but the kingdom itself already seemed very absent, since there were no physical acts of participation and little memory of such performances. The headmen, however, still enjoyed some prestige and took their cuts from the general climate of extortion, as the weakest partner in a toxic nexus with the Pano interpreters and the resentful high-caste police sub-inspector who had been sent to this primitive place with no cinema as a punishment posting. During the 1970s, two major transitions were nearing their peak, though I didn't understand this at the time. Firstly, to Christianity, and secondly, to modern governance through participation in elections. The governments, so it's not easy to work out quite the order or the sequence of the impact of Christianity and government programs. The government's development programs in the 1980s increased the inflow of wealth to this area, but it was actually the church-induced literacy and bilingualism which staunched the outflow. Like medicine and reduced mortality, these came first from the Canadian Baptist missionaries, who first made a tentative appearance in a nearby town in the early 1900s, then established a hospital, started translating the Bible, and were finally thrown out at the end of the 1970s. It was these missionaries who trained the first Sora to occupy the positions that the government reserved for scheduled tribe quotas. So on every point, the government was a latecomer, being quite ineffectual until the 1980s, when the transformative impetus of Christianity was picked up by universal schooling. Until then, so long as the state reached the Sora through the filter of feudal structures, local henchmen frustrated all the best intentions of government programs. No government officers knew Sora, and they all came up against the brick wall of the Barik translators. Panchayat Raj, the regime of village councils, arrived here in the late 1960s, but it was limited until the 1980s because its budget was small and it was easily captured by the Bariks. On the map, Sora land is very close to outside towns and villages, and in the 1980s, the gap between political and physical space suddenly collapsed. Rajiv Gandhi used the panchayats to pour money into tribal development, especially for roads and schools. So can we have slide number 4? Is that 4? Yeah. So this list contains no Sora roots at all very much from languages you probably all know. So the Bariks were suddenly, with literacy and learning Odia, the Bariks were suddenly revealed as having only one skill to underpin all their other techniques of intimidation and fraud, and the monopoly on interpreting between the two languages. They disappeared more totally than the headmen, who, though they had partly been the Bariks' puppets, still owned much of each village's paddy fields. The power of the headmen started to fade as the state moved toward more direct rule, now receiving land tax in place of the Raja through the Tahsildars. Everywhere, paths of officialdom led instead to the civil authorities of the modern democratic state, which was becoming participatory in a new way. Through the 1990s onwards, the police had become more answerable, and young Sora, made literate by church and school, had started to become policemen themselves, as well as teachers and revenue officers. So we could say that the focus of attention now is shifting from ethnic or caste boundaries to networks, class and patronage, that is, from essence and status to action and effectiveness. Widening participation in the outside world has also led to a more direct engagement with Hindu forms of religiosity. Instead of shamans marrying these dimly understood Kshatriya spirits, there are now several neo-Hindu movements in some parts of Soraland, strongly influenced by the VHP. And these agendas, of course, make myth and legend into something highly political. For them, tribes like the Sora are not spiritually or culturally distinct, but merely occupy a specialized ecological niche in the jungle. They're not aboriginal, they're not Adivasi, they're just forest dwellers, Vanvasi. The soil of India is all Hindu, so everybody must be Hindu unless they've been led astray by foreign conquerors or missionaries. And so the promotion of orthodox Hindu values, the cult of Krishna and Rama and Hanuman, among tribals is presented not as conversion, but as a rediscovery of their true nature as Hindus who became lost in the jungle and need to be brought back. So where Christianity talks of a rupture with the past, whatever you were doing before was primitive and should be discarded entirely, this kind of neo-Hinduism is a futurist reform movement based on a return to a mythic past. And around the Sora, there is even a specialized local variant, because it now turns out, according to some propaganda, that key episodes in the Ramayana happened right here in Sora land. Rama's exile took place here. It was the Sora who taught him to use bows, arrows, and axes. And Rama's companion, Hanuman, the monkey god, was actually Sora. And if you don't believe it, just look at the long tail on a Sora loincloth. Now, anthropological studies of Christian conversion, which is a big topic in anthropology now, generally assumes that Christian belief itself is the lure. And this echoes the Christian rhetoric, of course, of rupture and vision of Christianity itself as an ultimate goal. But in India, at least, this is no sure one-way street. And in Soraland, I think these new Christian and Hindu forms are functional equivalents. Which one you convert to depends largely on your personal networks and which village you live in. And the Sora example, I think, shows that when new opportunities appear, conversion is not just toward a new religious form, but also away from an old style of entangled relations. Now, Panchayat rule and development programs impose Odia and English words on any language in their path. But by contrast, the Christian missionaries had a typically Protestant policy of indigenizing the biblical message by repurposing existing Sora words. The Roman Empire, ancient Israel, caste India, these are all vertical structures. But the missionaries were careful to derive the titles of their authority figures entirely from Sora roots. And the Sora roots inevitably have strongly egalitarian implications. So can we have slide number 5? Okay, so these are new Sora bureaucratic and quite hierarchical words, some of them, derived entirely by inventing new Sora words from existing Sora roots. Now, at first sight, the Baptist Christian Church offers an egalitarian ideology in which all members of the congregation are status equals. All people call each other brother and sister, and so on. But this happens in a highly vertical church structure of officials. And these officials have the authority to teach you, to harangue you, and judge you. Pastors are powerful givers or withholders of favors, and they can transfer their underlings around Sora villages, just as happens in the civil administration and the police. So the old animist funeral cult, which chanted the list of ancestors very carefully, that is all abolished. The lineage is still exogamous, but it's no longer the organizing principle or main form of grouping. And young Baptists have very little knowledge of other branches, even of their own lineage. Instead, the Sora Baptist Association, Kinutduai, which is on that list, is organized into 31 parishes, each with a pastor, and various assistants, secretaries, cooks, and so on, replicated over some 800 village congregations. So this structure is pyramidal and segmentary, and closely resembles the nested territories of the civil administration, the Zilla, the subdivision, the Tassel, and so on. And in older Sora, nouns generally denoted objects and tools, or spiritual and existential concepts. But as the church becomes bureaucratized, a new class of longer abstract nouns evolves, formed by inserting a nounifying particle into a verb. This is like English words ending in ization or ification. Can we have slide number 6? A lot of these are created to translate abstract nouns from Greek in the Bible. Okay, you can see the nouns on the right are quite authoritarian nouns compared to the kind of nouns that were available in animist Sora. So the Baptist person is subject to vertical church authority. Previously, morality was maintained by a combination of public opinion and negotiation with ancestors. Now public opinion is drawn into this same vertical structure, topped by the authority of God. And this gives rise to a new kind of individual who is subject to judgment and punishment through a language of internalized moral responsibility. And this is controlled by the church's techniques of surveillance, public denunciation, and contrition. And these are entirely built by giving new meaning to old indigenous Sora words. Slide 7, please. So if you look at those, mel previously was an active verb in which you examined an omen, a chicken liver or something like that. Now it's been turned into a reflexive verb in which you inspect your own inner soul. And similarly, organs that are known from cutting up animals are now the seat of moral responsibility. So to go back to our two senses of political, dialogues between living and dead are political in the sense of living together well, and they are very horizontal. The living and the dead frequently accuse each other of bad behavior and defend themselves, and these structures are designed to lead from conflict to resolution in order to achieve consensus in judging values and deciding action. So apart from resorting to sorcery or the police, there is no other level of absolute arbitration. Nobody has the authority to command, only to shame or threaten or appeal to sentiment and obligation, and the voices of the dead. So Christianity brings a change in speech genres, which become internally authoritarian instead of dialogic. In the Baptist Church, authority comes not from what you work out jointly with ancestors, but from the text of the Bible and those who are authorized to interpret it. So you can see this is a modification of the old religion's fetishization of writing in the shaman's literate helper spirits. By the 1990s, the growing literacy of young Baptists was already making their parents awe at its mystique seem ridiculous. So an animist ritual persuades by debate, but a Baptist service persuades by assertion and exhortation. And in this new kind of performance, horizontal dialogue is replaced by two vertical formats. The first is prayer, which is a plea to powers who are higher than you. Well, you couldn't pray to ancestors because they weren't higher than you. And its derivation from the Sora word for begging speech is very interesting, I think. We had that in a previous slide. Because again, that is addressed by a lower being to a superior. The second genre is monologue. And the old animists didn't really have monologue because nobody would stop long enough to listen to it. In a monologue, you participate not by speaking, but by being spoken to. And you sit on the floor below a raised table to be harangued by male preachers. And the sermon format, I think, is more like a political speech. And the church service sometimes seems less of a ritual and more of a rally. So can we have video number 2, please? Basically, the man on the platform is telling us that God is displeased with us, we're not good enough for God, and so on. Thank you. So the contrast is enormous, I think, with the embraces and the weepings and the babblings of the shamans and their clients before. I hope that's very obvious. So the panchayat was not the only institution that undermines the headman and the barracks. That was what the government intended. But the Baptist Church was already a powerful machine, which sidelined the headman in every village. So in effect, the pastors and the other church officials are the successors of the headman and their deputies. Like them, they're Sora insiders, and they tend to intermarry to form an elite. They also replace the shamans as the only spiritual channel. Whereas animist Soras were redeemed from death and suffering by their own ancestors, and the word redeem was really important in the old language. Now Christians are redeemed by Jesus, working through Baptist pastors. And it turns out, of course, that's why I was doing the analysis of vocabulary, that this word redeem is the key word which links the two religions. But what is crucially different is who redeems us, ancestors or Jesus, and what we are redeemed from, because the old timers had no concept of sin. So using this technique of creating new nouns, Christians create some key theological terms by adapting the older Sora verbs. So can we have slide 8, please? So the first one is indeed this word to redeem, tandi, and when you put this noun infix, you get redemption. Then forgiving gives you forgiveness, fault or blame gives you blameworthiness, and so on. All these new abstract nouns, which are part of a whole system of values and judgment. The name Jesus was easily adapted into Sora, but God is more complicated, because the world was made by various male and female gods, but they stayed behind in mythic time, and they have little current engagement with the world. But the missionaries used this word, kitung, as an active principle in human life. And his functions were qualified by terms which had to be translated from Hebrew and Greek, each carrying its own resonance. In early editions of Bible texts, Creator God and Living God, but now almost exclusively Lord God. So could we have slide 9? I hope you can read that. So first of all, the Christian God, they've taken this old creator being category, kitung, and they've given him a capital letter to start with and made him a supreme being. And then to translate Lord God, they use this word kitung again, which is the second element, and gomang, which is the word for village headman. So he's a headman god. The missionaries avoided Sanskritic words for God because these were redolent of Brahmanism, and they took pains to develop this cosmic and existential concept from a Sora root. But there were no Sora roots from which to elaborate the core political concept of command, as in Lord God. The Hebrew melech, the Greek basileus and kyrios, could be rendered only by two non-Sora words, which were both cornerstones of the old feudal regime. We already met them in the feudal vocabulary list. Raja, of course, and Gomang again, the village headman. And for other officials, because the Bible is full of officials, the translation avoids the local Odia titles of any of the feudal henchmen. And I think that's for a reason, because these figures were widely feared and hated. They were very negative. Because when feudal styles of power below the king are brought out into the open, they reveal the fundamental problem of legitimacy and acceptance, as these very terms reveal them to be predatory outsiders. So with the exception of Pisirian for angel, which is a translation of the Greek angelos, messenger, titles and roles are glossed by descriptive adjectives of size and height. If you look at the biblical officials, big priests, front road people, teaching the law people. And if we look at kings and patrons and followers, what are the political implications of the Christians' new relationships with Jesus? Well, this relationship is reciprocal, but in a new way. Whereas reciprocity with ancestors was horizontal, that with Jesus is vertical. And this is a totally new form of verticality, which is no longer extractive, it's no longer extortionate, but it's reflected in a vocabulary of generosity and love, which the Sora had never before experienced from a superior. And that's 9D, Jesus as a generous patron. These were already ordinary words in Old Sora, but they've been given a new impetus and a new meaning. They were all horizontal words. So because they were horizontal words, of course, this major political shift is not immediately flagged up by a specific vocabulary. You wouldn't notice it if you were just looking at word lists, but rather by the way that it is applied. Unlike ancestors, Jesus has no hunger, no longing, and no needs. He's not short of clothing or food. He's not attached to his gold earrings like dead people. He's not envious of somebody else inheriting a patch of land. He doesn't need anything that humans can give, except loyalty, and we'll come to that. In animist sacrifice, animal blood is shed to feed hungry ancestors. But Jesus's blood flows in the opposite direction, not to him as a hungry spirit, but from him as a willing sacrifice, in a total generosity arising from surplus. And Christianity has a particular concept of this, divine grace, that God has so much he can afford to give infinitely. So although this is a distinctive Christian moral and spiritual logic, it also opens a window onto the wider Hindu world through the idea of patronage, with kingship as its supreme exemplar. In Hindu political theory, though not in tribal experience, kingship is not extractive, but generous. Rulers, as Anndatta, the giver of bread, should give rather than take in a relationship which is vertical and yet benevolent. And I have a quote from Anastasia here. Giving and receiving were not just economic transactions, but socially and politically constitutive acts which authorized kingly rule and defined political communities. This model of verticality, reciprocal rather than parasitic, runs directly counter to previous Sora experience, in which Rajas extracted produce and revenue through the thick filter of their local enforcers. Christianity, as I said, introduced this model for the first time. And indeed, it is very similar to the rationale for the followers of a biblical king and of Jesus himself. And I have found many quotes about that. Jesus also gives material benefits through church handouts, as well as paid positions and other influence. And here, as with literacy, the church was ahead of the Indian welfare state, with its reserved tribal quotas in education and employment, and its very recent widows' pensions and subsidized rice. The reciprocity of goodness flowing from Jesus is not like the egalitarian cyclical exchange with ancestors based on the shared identity of kinship, but comes in exchange for devotion, expressed again, as the church constantly does, through new words or new resonances adapted from old Sora roots. So if you look at 9e, there is a vocabulary of faithfulness and loyalty there. So through their covenant, God and Jesus treat us with asuyum. They are dernadagi to us. And of course, this is reciprocal. We must also feel the same about them. And in the Hindu areas, which I haven't been able to study, well, the Neo-Hindus, the Sora who turned to Rama and Krishna experienced devotion to their gods in a very similar way, with similar hymns, prayers, and iconography. And that's something I want to do a lot more research on in the future. So all of this is verticality as true hierarchy, a relationship in which the higher level returns something vital to the lower level. In South Asia, differences of rank do not prevent relations, but promote intimacy between parties in distinct and complementary roles. That's a quote from Anastasia again. Such hierarchy may be the foundation of Indian social theory, but it's not how the Sora have experienced verticality in the past. By making themselves clients of Jesus and God, chronologically before they became clients of the state, Baptist Sora have liberated themselves from the one-way vertical structures of feudal extortion. And all this happened at a time when actual kingship has already become obsolete, and any memory of real kings is fading fast from living memory. The imagery of kingship no longer corresponds to any political reality, and the vocabulary of archaic Jewish priests and elders doesn't correspond to the officials in the Sora's own experience. However, the kingly model of vertical hierarchy has taken on a new life in the relationship between followers and modern democratic politicians. And this is another area where I want to do more research in this project. Yet this analogy also reveals a crucial difference. If the chain of subordination which came down from the old Rajas via henchmen was single and inescapable, The new hierarchical verticality is no longer exclusive. These patronal positions must be constantly negotiated through performances that seek to earn and retain their followers' loyalty. There are always alternatives, set against each other in permanent competition. This competition applies not only to political parties and their candidates, but also to Christian denominations. Jesus often said, "Follow me." But through which patronal network? The Canadian Baptist missionaries did the hard work of translation and institution building, but they have been gone since the late 1970s. The Sora Bible and hymn books are there for the picking, making the 180,000 registered members of their self-funding association a tempting target for predator Christian denominations moving in from the plains, with more money and a less austere style of worship. You can be demoted from the Baptist church hierarchy because your sins of illicit sex or drinking have been publicized. But the Catholics nearby have a more relaxed view of such things and are happy to scoop up disgraced Baptists. Baptists are now also lured with food, lodging and education grants from Pentecostals, Lutherans, East India, Crusade, Brethren, Derna, Seba Barato, Seventh-day Adventists, Compass, World Vision, Good News, and so on. And in addition, in India, a Christian god can never be the only one because the surrounding world is so very Hindu. The bus stands, the cinema posters, the temples, the wayside shrines, the vibhuti, the public festivals and prayers, the nationalism, the loudspeaker songs. It seems inevitable that some animist Sora would also start shifting to Hindu sects. And indeed, as I said, there are now substantial Sora neo-Hindu movements. So in the new democratic state, which the Sora can now access, the king's mantle of patronage has passed to the politicians. Kings could occasionally suffer rebellions if they were not sufficiently generous in return for the peasants' revenue. For modern politicians, retaining the loyalty of followers is fast and furious work, because choice between alternative chains of patronage is what the electoral system is all about. I was present during the momentous 1977 election in which Indira Gandhi was thrown out of office. Nobody I knew voted. By 2000, most younger people had become clients of a political party or its local representative. They had mostly supported Congress since Rajiv Gandhi's development program in the 1980s and his charismatic helicopter appearance in Soraland on the morning of his assassination in 1991. When the Odisha Chief Minister Naveen Patnaik visited the area around 2007, many people switched to his regional Biju Janata Dal party. Patnaik was re-elected in 2019 for a 5th term, and the Christian Sora voted overwhelmingly for him as a bulwark against the expansion of the BJP into the state. But this was a shift not of ideology, but of patron. Baptists, rival Christian denominations, various Hindu cults and political parties are each what the Sora call an ompu. Could we have slide 10, please? The fundamental structure of groups has changed. Previously, the names of ancestors were chanted in rituals. After the Christian abolition of the ancestor cult, this structure can't be sustained. Now the lineage is not actually performed in any way, and Christian events are organized by parishes centered on churches and combining several lineages. The social world of young Sora is now composed largely of ompus, religious groups and political parties that can be chosen. These groups are based not on birth, so people may be born into a religion or sect, but on recruitment and retention through patronage and clientelism. Young people have a new arena of agency and opportunity, but they have to constantly adjust their position amidst shifting units of solidarity, protection, and advantage. And this multiplicity of forms and idioms is not a multiplicity of equivalence and complementarity, like multiple exogamous lineages, but of rivalry. Membership in an ompu is fickle, as people switch between religions and parties, often for instrumental reasons, and their loyalty is not necessarily rooted in a commitment, whether to Christianity or Hinduism, to capitalism or socialism. Faith is not what it was among the fervent early Baptist converts with their visions of Jesus, and the church struggles to police its members' spiritual sincerity and stop them drifting off. So we can say that all but the most dedicated religious members resemble floating voters. Everyone must belong to ompus to live a modern life, and the more socially and economically active you are, the more ompus you belong to or switch between. This is the social ferment, unleashed by the switch from the parasitic single-track vertical form of isolated jungle kingdoms to the multiple hierarchical and patronal possibilities of the modern democratic state. I have a 5-minute conclusion. Do I have time for it? Yeah, okay. So this exercise in philological archaeology confirms, in very specific terms, my ethnographer's intuition about the sharp separation of the domains of the political in the two senses I outlined at the start, the domain of directive action versus that of living together well. Until the 1980s, Sora in this area scratched a living, paying what little cash they had for fines, bribes, and overpriced sacrificial buffalo. This life was set in a dualistic cosmology of insider-outsider. Inside was an egalitarian, mutually supportive, ancestor-based cosmology, which contained both the explanation for their problems and the never-ending treatment, in which everyone participated avidly and exercised intense agency, though on a small local canvas. Outside was a vertical structure of feudal exploitation derived from distant rajas and experienced through the extortions of petty henchmen. The Sora were unable to participate in it as agents, only as patients. The state, still experienced in largely feudal terms in the 1970s, was characterized largely by a terminology from outside languages, or in Sora by a vocabulary representing the aggressive aspect of spirits without their counterbalancing protective ancestor aspect. This was vertical authority emanating from persons and structures of higher status and power, but it was not hierarchical in a full sense because there was no reciprocity, no obligation for the higher party to take responsibility for the well-being of the lower party. Administrators and anthropologists, somewhat romantically, have traditionally thought of India's tribals as enjoying an extraordinary social autonomy. But we've seen that in political terms, at least, this is an illusion. My study of tribal ancestors and shamans' kshatriya husbands in the underworld suggests that much of that cultural difference can be seen as an ironic resistance to the actual closeness of their relationship. It has been argued, for example, by Vibha Joshi and others, that the Naga became Christians in order to resist the Indian state. It seems to me that the Sora have become Christians in order to join it, but on better terms than before. The advent of Christianity, followed by the modern electoral state, revealed the old feudal state as having no framework to earn their subordinates' loyalty. With the new vision opened up by Baptist missionaries and government agencies, Sora lost sight of the earlier reciprocal role of ancestors in nourishing good living, and saw them only as parasitic, ironically as resembling the feudal exploitation of their actually existing political system. Both Christian missionaries and high caste government officials have their own reasons for portraying traditional Sora religion as oppressive, but both missed the point that the oppression was actually built into the structure of governance. It didn't come from the Sora spirits. The Sora's collective emancipation comes through a structure and a set of values which combine bureaucratic hierarchy with the virtue ethics of the cultivation of the individual soul. This tension between the collective and the individual has a long history in newly Christianizing societies. I found some fascinating stuff about early Europe. And on this point, Sora Christianity often seems like an uncertain religion still in the process of formation. And I think this is also reflected in the constant creativity of political language. What is striking is how closely the patronage of Jesus matches the hierarchical structure and munificent values of classic Hindu kingship, and how this model is now readily transferred to the politicians and institutions of the modern electoral nation-state. So my final point. With an increasing shift from victimhood to participation, there has been emerging a more specific political vocabulary out of a wider field of relational terms within the Sora language itself. This new situation raises a series of questions which it is too soon to answer. We can predict that there will be a very strong influx from hegemonic Odia, Sanskrit, and English. How far will these words be calqued back into Sora, now that the missionaries who favoured indigenization of vocabulary have gone, and now that all young Sora know Odia? To the extent that such a Sora vocabulary now reflects a Christian tone, how far will this be shared or accepted by Neo-Hindu Sora? Will the two language registers drift apart? Or will the Christian vocabulary, currently so dominant, succumb to the Hindu tone of wider Indian society? What will be the dominant metaphor of future political vocabulary? Will it still be rooted in obsolete images of kingship? Or will a new vocabulary evolve which reveals differences between this and the patronal systems of electoral politics and the welfare state? And if one of the, finally, if one of the supposed defining features of tribal identity in India is that they did not participate fully in hierarchical relations of patronage, how will all of this change Sora identity politics? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Piers. So much to think about. And I do expect there'll be lots and lots of questions. So we are just following the standard raise your hand, and I will be on the lookout for raised hands, and I will ask you to speak. But if you have a question that's on the point of the current discussion, just turn yourself on, turn your video on, wave your hand, and I'll call on you out of order, because I think it would be a good idea to have pertinent questions asked at the right time. So I will start by asking a question about the categories of religion and politics in the Sora world. In the history of European segregation of the categories of the spheres of human life, which have been traced by historians of political thought, as well as, by Dumont, for instance, who's talked about the rise of the categories of the economic, the political, and the religious. We know, or at least we think we know, that the category of the political arose in tandem. It was concomitant with the rise of the category of the religious. So both appeared in as sort of contrast to the others. So the idea of the political as being a separate sphere of activity, of human activity, as well as a separate sphere of moral imagination and moral reasoning, is very much part and parcel of the rise of the idea that religious thinking was, religious morality was separable from otherwise morality. And again, that very Machiavelli played an important part in this process. Now, it seems to me that what you're describing is extraordinarily similar insofar as the appearance of religion as something that is separable from otherwise relations, living together well, just humans coexisting, beings coexisting in a relational world. Suddenly there's a church to which you go, a morality that is discrete and distinguishable. And then suddenly you have politics and a vocabulary for politics. That is what it appears to me that that's what's happening. I may be wrong. Is that what's happening? And if you were to get rid of religion, if you were to get rid of the Baptist Christianity and go back to relational Sora world with spirits and other beings that isn't separable from anything else that goes on, would politics disappear as well?
I suppose it's analytically hard to distinguish the two aspects of this story, because the church and the development state sort of came at more or less the same time with very similar agendas, at least in social policy. So they reinforce each other. I suppose a very important, well, even the old feudal system, of course, there was politics all the way through, and it was very separate from religion, because religion was so very introverted and very internal. So if anything, we could say that they were more different then than they are now.
But am I right to understand that there was no religion, there was no category for religion? There's no separable sphere of activity. There were relations. Yeah,
there were, of course.
Right.
I mean, they now use the word dharma. What is your dharma? Is it Christian or Muslim or Hindu?
Right.
So these two are ompus and choices. So
Yeah.
it seems that the concept of religion arises only with the concept of choice between alternatives. And of course, that's exactly how politics works.
Interesting.
So before there weren't choices in that.
And there wasn't religion.
No.
It's what yeah.
Everybody had their own ancestors from whom they derived, and those ancestors kept on reminding you of their presence and making demands and so on. And you had constant observers used to think that the Sora were the most religious. Elwin said it was the most religious tribe he'd ever met anyway. And I'm sure that was true. There are shamans in trance every day, or they certainly were. So it was a very dominant, governing kind of domain in Sora life. And everything that we might call politics was outside that, except for the compensation mechanisms. So I think the shamans marrying Kshatriya spirits in the underworld was a very crucial kind of link between these two domains. It was a compensation, it was an ironization. They were playing with it in an extraordinary way. And there used to be all that Srinivas kind of talk about Sanskritization and Brahminization and so on, I think, but it's really Kshatriyization which counts, because it was secular military power that they fetishized. The power of military and of clerks.
Thank you. Lisa Mitchell. Lisa, are you there? Lisa?
She has a question in the chat.
Okay.
I'm sorry, my camera and microphone aren't working.
Yes, Lisa, can you speak live, or I can't find your question in the chat.
She says, my question has to do with how collective decisions have been made and what changes have occurred. Okay. In the old system, collective decisions were made by this extraordinary process of negotiation. And often there were two sides. They were like court cases, you could say, because, for example, when somebody dies, especially when a married woman died, her brother's lineage and her husband's lineage might have rival inquests and call her to turn up in rival rituals, and each try to persuade her to say what they want. Especially a lot of these were about the inheritance of land and property. So consensus, I transcribed and translated some of these texts, and you can see they're fascinating, like sort of play scripts, how people eventually have to come round to consensus, because you have to know how that dead person is going to affect everybody in the future, how they're going to attack them or protect them or whatever. But there was obviously a leak in that system, because people were always reporting each other to the police, which immediately gives the police an opportunity to come in and extort bribes. So it was a very violent, dangerous thing to do to other people, but they did it all the time. And the headmen were hand in glove with the barriques, and so were also extorting bribes from their own villagers. So the consensus model of the dialogues between living and dead was obviously quite fragile. Now there are other things that come in the way. For example, for property disputes, there's actually law. You can go down to town and use advocates. And there have been legal reforms. For example, daughters are allowed to inherit and so on. And this cuts right across what ancestors say about it. So it's a complex question. Now the church, this is the main dominant grouping within a village. There is the panchayat with a representative from each village, but the church meets every day, and especially on Sundays. And so this gives the pastors a huge amount of power to manipulate, again, consensus, because there are all those people you saw sitting on the floor who are sort of under the control of the people on the platform, but the position of the people on the platform is fragile, because they can be outed for being naughty and then they get demoted down to the floor. So all the way through, I think consensus, there is a constant striving for consensus, but it's quite fragile.
Thank you. Sarthak Bagchi, please.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is related to the idea of gender in these, when the democratization happened, or in the mix between politics and religion, and also since you also mentioned Naveen Patnaik's party, which also plays a lot of emphasis on the idea of women candidates and putting women candidates, and especially with the devolution of power at the panchayati level. So I was just wondering that if all of these things have changed or have had any impact on the role of gendered performances, among the tribe, or in everyday politics or something like that, because certainly something, the idea of the village or the tribe headman might have also gone through some change. So I was just wanting to know a little bit more about the, the role of gender, or how it has changed over time.
A very interesting question. I think there can be local processes which go in the opposite direction of the bigger picture. So yes, there are government moves towards female emancipation in all sorts of ways, including education, of course. But in the old animist system, of course, the women were already highly emancipated in just the way that everybody thinks in fantasy terms about tribals. It was actually true. The women had a lot of sexual freedom and domestic freedom and so on. Now the church, all the Christian movements and the neo-Hindu movements are very anti-feminist. They're very masculist. So they are pushing, and the BJP and VHP and all these people are. So they are pushing everything in the opposite direction. So it seems to me that young Sora women now are a lot more restricted than they were 40 years ago.
Okay.
Even though they have more education opportunities, of course, because 40 years ago, nobody got education.
Right. So, I mean, from a very liberated sphere, they went into more restriction, but then through the democratization and other things, that has not yet impacted so much to free them from these restrictions.
Well, it has, and there have been female sarpanches and so on. But
my question specifically is that, are they also seen in the same embodiment of the patron, or that idea?
Perhaps, I don't know, because this is research I still have to do. My research over the past 40 years has always been about religion, and I'm only now shifting to this. So the process of electoral politics and so on, I know very little yet about how this works among the Sora today. But I will, thanks for your question, I will add that to my list of things to look out for.
Thank you.
There's a question from Rashmi Singh. Rashmi, do you want to reveal yourself and ask it instead of just having the chat?
Hi. I don't have a question per se, but I'm just very curious as to whether there was a vocabulary for, interrelationships or politics between each other and, outside. So I noticed that, you have used the word ombu for cliques and groups, but is there a vocabulary for friend enemy, for the friend enemy dyad, for friendship, for rivalry, adversarial politics, and so on? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, mostly things are done through kinship terminology. Everybody is addressing each other by kinship terms all the time. And the church has picked that up, and everybody in the congregation calls each other brother and sister. So this is another undermining of the lineage, because within the lineage and between lineages, of course, there were very specific kin and affine terms for people of your own lineage and people of in-law lineages. So again, the kinship terminology is doing most of that work. For the word friend, there are a couple of words, gari and sango, which I think must come from Odia, or maybe Hindi, I don't know, because they picked it up in the Assam tea gardens. So I would say friend was not a strong a strong word. It wasn't strongly represented in the vocabulary. It was almost an unnecessary word, I suppose. In the same way as in Indian languages, please and thank you tend to be underrepresented because they're not necessary. You already know what they would mean if they were said. So, and if somebody became friends with some outsider or stranger, they would say, yeah, he's my brother. They would invent a kinship term.
But what's interesting here is that what Rashmi is pointing to is that, I mean, she's asking whether there is a vocabulary that distinguishes between allies and rivals, as it were, right? That because a brother is someone that you both fight with, you love them, you fight with them.
Absolutely.
But enemy versus, friend, rival, adversary, and so on is a very different vocabulary of competition.
Yeah. I don't think that vocabulary exists, as far as I know. These words for this Sango and Gadi were used mostly with outsiders, non-Soras, to describe some relationship in which we have some relationship as trading partners or somebody I visit when I go to town. And I've never come across a word for enemy. What you have is words of judgment saying that somebody is a good person or a bad person. There's a lot of vocabulary about that.
But that's different.
Yes.
Enemy, friend is a matter of people being on your side or not on your side.
Yeah. On the whole, no. But again, I will look out for that. But I think after speaking language for a long time, if I can't think of those words, that is significant.
It's very significant.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Also, just a tuppence. Francesca is waiting to ask a question. She's typed it up, but I would like Francesca for you to ask it. But before that, I just wanted to say that presumably, as a sort of a standard political theorist would think that Sora would be perfect Democrats, that they would slot with their perfectly egalitarian world that you're describing. They would fit ideally into the democratic order. But it seems from what you're saying that it's the other way around. They joined it the moment the world stood up.
But is democracy horizontal or vertical? It's certainly vertical if you're a client of a politician.
Okay, Francesca.
Sorry, takes me a little while, I suppose, for things to turn on, but probably you can hear me. Thank you very much. I'm of course very interested in in working with words and clusters of words and vocabularies and what you can do with them. And as you can see, my question is to say, I mean, things look quite neat when they are, spread out like this, and these words belong to this vocabulary and this, view of the world, and these words belong to that vocabulary and that different view of the world, and there is a before and after, or they seem quite exclusive of each other. And I wonder whether when you turn to either, individual users or individual users, either in the same situation, shifting or combining, or perhaps, moving from one situation in which they will tend to use one set of terms to another situation in which they will use another, so, I mean, you can see, where my question is going, so I suppose is the kind of, in linguistics also, the idea of a, language spread out there, and instead more, performance and agency and I suppose, maybe even more gray areas or more sort of creative combinations that, you would be, if you lay things out, you'd be really surprised to see.
Yeah. Well, of course. So, and that is why I did mention, at least, that I was interested in genres, speech genres as well. And if you notice, for example, that video clip from the church, everybody else has no right of reply. So when you have dialogues between living and dead, or just dialogues between people who are all living, there is a huge amount of interruption, of indignation, obscenities, laughter, all sorts of things going on all the time. And you can relate that to various emotional states and various processes that are going on in people's lives. My first book was called Dialogues with the Dead, and that had very long, detailed transcripts of dialogues. And what you see from there is a lot of interruption. So I think what the new format does is it really does switch speech into large blocks with fewer interruptions. And again, the latest, I did lots of intensive fieldwork 40 years ago, and much less intensively in the last few years with a very rapidly changed situation. So a lot of these things are things that I still have to find out, but I have attended a lot of church meetings and analyzed those, and on the whole I find them very coercive. And I think the dialogue form can't be very coercive because there's always the option to switch out, to take over, for the other party to take over. Right. And that's why that earlier question somebody asked about consensus, I think that's why that's part of the process of arriving at consensus, that it's a slow and difficult process. It can sometimes take several years for people to agree on the significance of somebody's death, for example. I'm not sure if
sorry, no, sure. Can I just have a little add-on? So, but, I wonder whether then, the suggestion is, or the implication is that, okay, then people who, accept this coercive, who stay silent in church and who accept this coercive speech and all this language and so on, I mean, is that kind of then I suppose the behavior that they will, replicate or okay, this is what we do in church, but outside it's a continuous kind of back and forth. You hope you won't get caught out.
Yes, you hope that you don't then get reported and denounced in church next Sunday. So and because young people now go down to town, they hang around in town a lot, so there's more drinking and there's more sex and so on in that kind of context. So to a certain extent, young people have to live a kind of double life. Yeah, sure.
More drinking and more sex in the cities. I thought Sora's before all this.
They did before they. Well, as we said the other day, church is a perpetual morning after.
Okay, Ram, please, and then Anastasia Krylova.
Hello, Piers. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think your organization of words was something I hope to match and in my own work. So it was really great to see how you track different ideas and notions, create language for politics, and where they come from. And so I was just so building on what I think other people have asked. I think especially Francesca's last question. So I'm curious about the whole. You mentioned a number of categories that were introduced by the colonial state that brings them into an engagement with the state, and I'm wondering, would you characterize that as a political engagement, and how did that question of resources, extraction of resources, and at some point organizing some kind of petitions, for example, or representation to question certain kinds of extractions? Did you find any evidence of that during the colonial period? And building on that, I'm also wondering whether there is some then continuity with those kinds of practices in independent India.
Well, one major problem of that, of course, is that paper doesn't last very long there. The termites take most stuff very quickly. So I did find some extraordinary documents. I went to Sora villages in the tea gardens in Assam, and people had indentured documents from the 1860s. Some people had managed to preserve. But I've hardly ever found any usable documents of any age, except for one Tahsildar who gave me the entire land rights register.
Wonderful.
Which I have here. And I said, but surely you need it, don't you? And he said, oh, no, I'm writing a things to say it was eaten by termites. You just take it.
Okay.
So he wasn't, I think he must have had another copy somewhere. But this is, it's written in old handwriting from the 1930s, actually.
Yeah.
So it's before the settlement. The settlement wasn't until the 60s. So I'm not sure quite what the status of this document was. Okay. But on the whole, there's almost nothing that I can find. But admittedly, I haven't done any serious archive research. And there are apparently archives in Madras, because this was part of the Madras presidency.
Yes, yeah.
So one of these days, I should go and chase that up.
Right. Wonderful. Thanks.
Anastasia Krylova, please. We've been waiting.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this perfect talk. It was really very interesting. I'm sorry, I have a technical note about my colleague Evgenia Renkovskaya, who joined us at first, and now she was dropped out because of problems with the network, and now she desperately tries to join back, but she can't because the join button is not active. If it's not active more, if it's possible, can you show her the way to join? And in any case, she just wants to say thank you also. And I have a.
You should just go back to the page with the seminars and join the session, and that should be all right.
Yes, she cannot click the join button.
Oh, okay.
Because it's inactive.
Okay, we'll try
now.
to sort it out. Yep. Okay.
Thank you. And I have some little terminological questions. First is that Gupa is obviously a Sanskrit word, and I wonder to know if it was previously in enemy's times used in Sora in its literal sense as a shepherd, or only in a religious sense.
Yes, it's the sorry, to answer that one, it's the ordinary word for a cow herder, somebody who you would take your cow out today, you're doing Gupa work.
Yes, thank you. So literally, it's a cow. Okay, and second is about this Sanskrit word for sin, pinto. I couldn't recognize it. I know sin as papa is in Sanskrit.
They also use the word papa and pinto as a kind of, maybe it's an echo form, which Sora is full of, double words. And sometimes the second word does or doesn't really mean anything on its own. But they use the word. And
what is its Sanskrit origin?
I don't know. But what it meant before Christianity was it was more like some kind of contamination, like sort of stepping in excrement or something. It's something you could wipe off, you could wash off. Whereas now it's an internal quality. And I think that's a major shift that comes with Christianity.
Oh, I see. Thank you. And the third question about Birinda, is it connected with the Hindi Biradari, or
I don't know.
like community or caste Biradari?
Perhaps I don't know, because there's
brotherhood.
Yeah, Austroasiatic philology is very sketchy and very underdeveloped, so it's very hard to check these things.
Yes, I just saw this word and remembered that maybe it's in Hindi or Odia loanword in Sora.
Maybe there are. I mean, people have moved around over history, and they've had lots of contacts. So in this double language that is used all the time, where you say one word and then you say another word as a synonym, as a near synonym, often those synonyms turn out to be Telugu or Kond or some other dialect. Sometimes they're from real languages, but sometimes quite far away, and sometimes they have no meaning, or a meaning which has been lost. So I think the linguistic complexity there is enormous, and I don't think there's anybody alive who really has a command of all the languages that are going on.
If Birinda is a loan word, it must be a new one, because in Hindi Biradari is a Persian loan word. Also.
I don't know. I mean, Persian words come in, of course, in the land revenue kind of context. And even the word riot, which I think is an Arabic word, and so on. Words move around. And so the Austroasiatic philologists try to insist that I have to find cognates in other Southeast Asian Austroasiatic languages before I can claim that a word is genuinely Sora. But it's almost impossible to do that. I think you have to rely on the shape of words as being a typically Austroasiatic shape.
I see. In some cases, when it is something from basic lexicon, it's easy, but not for.
For example, with agriculture, names of plants and trees can be traced all the way through Southeast Asia, through Vietnamese tribal languages, through Cambodian and so on. We have cognates all the way through. But no other domain has been investigated.
Thank you.
There's a question, one from Tom Hertzmark and another from Dale. Is Tom first. Switch yourself on. You're muted.
Hello. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much, Piers. That was wonderful. I was just thinking about Francesca's question and how I felt like Francesca was perhaps asking for a bit more grey area and ambiguity in this. But I feel what's really clear is how extreme the transformation has been in terms of people's social relations and the ways that power is exercised. And I think of the pairing that you have in the title, from parasitic feudalism to responsible hierarchy. And in a sense, I'm wondering, even though the vocabulary has kind of shifted and there are a few new words, the idea of responsibility seems somewhat underemphasized. And in the examples you gave from the Baptist Church, in that emphasis on kind of individual virtue ethics and people having to make their own choices and being suddenly responsible in a new way for their actions. The term responsibility, is that you're using that in a sense to respond, to talk about individual people's responsibility for their own actions, which is a slightly different sense from responsible hierarchy, as I understood it, as being responsible for others in a hierarchical relation. So I wondered perhaps if you could say a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thanks. No, you're right. That is two very different senses of responsibility. And there's a limit to how much you can cram into 40 minutes. But I think the point about each sense of responsibility has different implications. So the one about your internal organs as being a place where some essence of you is focused, an essence which can be judged. I link that rather closely to the sort of surveillance state that the church runs, in effect. The other kind of hierarchy, that vertical sense, I suppose what I want to emphasize is first what a total absence there was of that under the old feudal system. That the Rajas were not obliged to give anything back to the people whom they taxed. That it's a system, so to speak, a one-way taxation as an extortion racket. And that is exactly what the modern politician can't do, and indeed is reversed, because this idea of a welfare state and the subsidized rice and all this kind of thing, development as it's called, is perhaps the most radical thing of all. I suppose it's more radical even than Christianity. So as far as concerns the word responsibility, yes, you're right. I'm using it in two different senses, and I should have pointed that out. In terms of the inner, there's another paradox about the Christian establishment, which I still haven't worked out, which is, on the one hand, there's this huge emphasis on personal responsibility and lots of sanctions. You get rewarded and punished quite significantly. On the other hand, there's a huge groupism. So somebody asked before about more or less people who are more or less bold or whatever. I think personalities, character counts for a lot. People have very different personalities, and in the past, it would be hard to talk about ambition because people didn't have careers. They sort of got up in the morning and went and harvested something or looked for something in the forest or did whatever needed doing that day. Headmen had ambitions to monopolize paddy fields and extort, and some of the big headmen kept some of their villagers as slaves, in effect, because they were indebted. But for ordinary people, you couldn't really talk about ambition in a sort of career path sense. And that is something else that has been introduced now. Through everybody's ambition is to become a teacher or a tahsildar or something of this sort, which is to get out of the situation you're in already. So people are moving out of villages into town and building cement houses and so on. In other words, they're trying to change their lives. And I think the old people didn't have that concept of changing your life. I'm sorry, I've wandered a bit, perhaps.
No, that's very interesting. I can't see you. Anyway, Dale has got a question. Dale, do you want to ask it?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question. You made a brief remark about the similarities between early Christianity and your field in the Sora case. So I was just curious about knowing what you were reading, because I think we could benefit from having a comparative perspective with Europe as well, right? Right now, it seems as if it was very natural for Europe to be Christian, right? That process of
yes.
Christianity being introduced into Europe is not necessarily something that we talk about. So I was just curious what you found as in terms of similarities. Thanks.
The Christianization of Europe was a very slow and painful process, and it was never completed. So a lot of areas of Europe, like Greece and Italy and Russia, are still full of all sorts of pagan beliefs and practices, which were never eliminated. And as late as, there are historians who've done work on this as late as the 15th, 16th century. Most of the population seem to have been still doing all sorts of pagan things. There is a really, really good book called The Ransom of the Soul by Peter Brown. And it's a study of the Western end of Europe in the first few centuries of the Christian period. And for the first couple of centuries, people were very much obsessed with the second coming. Jesus is going to come at any minute. And are you ready? And what is going to happen when you are judged? And then the centuries went by and Jesus never turned up. And so the emphasis rather went to a different direction, which is people started worrying about the souls of the dead instead. What's going to happen? You know, my mother, my uncle, whoever, they're still dead and they haven't been redeemed because the end of the world hasn't yet come. And perhaps they're being punished in hell, perhaps they're in some terrible situation. So people started funding special rituals, special church services, building of churches and cathedrals, aristocrats did, in order to win merit for the souls of their dead parents. And this, Brown shows how this is the origin actually of the huge wealth and the great art of the Middle Ages. So that is a book I would really recommend.
Excellent. And we are now, on that note, now that we've gone comparative, I think we can end the discussion unless anyone, I don't see any more questions. There's one, Rajaraman Sundarasan is saying, could anyone please write the name of the book that Professor Peter suggested? Professor Piers, yes. Write it in the chat, please, Piers. But thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Piers, ever so much for deliciously rich talk. Lots to think about, and I have heard you speak about your material a few times, but I think a lot of new ideas have come out today, both out of your talk and out of the questions that people asked. So thank you very much. And we hope to see all of you again in a fortnight's time when Lisa Björkman will be giving a talk. And she's still mulling over the title. She's got lots of things to say, but I hope to see you all there and have a good weekend.
Well, thank you all for joining in and for the questions, because I'm hoping to embark on a new phase of research, and this will help me to work out what to look for.
Terrific. And hopefully we will all be able to do it in India soon.
We hope.
And on that note, stay tuned and goodbye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye.